Well, looking, I suppose, at the area generally, and I suppose it's an area where there aren't a huge number of robust statistics, interestingly. We're looking at some of the research from Catalyst and from others, which would suggest EU 28 is looking in and around the 30s, and we're looking in and around 25%. Now, it's a low base we're starting from, and we need to do a lot better. But it's interesting, the research as to why that's happening, because obviously we have a lot to do in terms of gender balance across the board, not just specifically to STEM industries, if you like. But we do know that there is a particular issue around science, technology, engineering, maths, knowledge intensive tech industries in terms of the fact that we tend to see fewer women going into them and also more women exiting them. And people talk about it being a pipeline issue, and how if we just got more women into STEM in the first place, that we'd kind of solve it over time. But that's only one part of the problem, I suppose. The core issue seems to be actually around, when studies have been done as to the women who stay and the women who leave, they're pretty much exactly the same on paper in terms of similar backgrounds, similar qualifications, possibly even similar family status. The difference is the organisational culture, and that seems to be the deal breaker. The ones who stay feel that they belong, feel that their organisation values what they have to say and is interested in what they have to say, and the ones who leave feel a completely different experience has been their experience in the organisation. So some of the research, I suppose, distills it down into kind of three kind of key areas around, well, what's actually going on for women in these organisations? Why are they not staying? Now, you kind of think to yourself, isolation, women feeling like they're a little bit like the outsider, because oftentimes they're the only person on the team or on the work site or involved, so they feel like an outsider. But all of the research says, but outsiders don't get access to the visible projects, the ones that actually lead to promotions, the ones that actually lead to a career track. So it is a big issue. They kind of are in the organisation, possibly the lone female, as I say, within the team or work site, but they also can't see anybody above them necessarily that looks like them. And it's very hard to be what you can't see. A lab coat culture is one where it's not really, having an issue around women per se, but the conditions of work really celebrate this idea of long working hours. It's a badge of honour, and therefore anybody who needs any level of flexibility or anything different is penalised for that and doesn't tend to get as far. The hard hat one is probably more around the macho kind of culture and sometimes derogatory behaviour or language, which can be really exacerbated if you're the only female in that team, and can be very difficult or uncomfortable for females in that particular environment. And then the third area is this idea of extreme work pressures, because we know with tech industries oftentimes it's a global, it's a 24/7 interface, and one that offers a huge amount of flexibility but also offers a huge amount of expectation of face time and always on. And looking at the research in the area, that the hours expected, the different time zones and so on, all provide a challenge and an opportunity. But if you're mixing that, say for example, with caring responsibilities, which we know economically and culturally and socially tend to fall more often to women than men, this can really be a problem. And while oftentimes the solution to it has been that women look to try and tread water for a period of time until they can get maybe their family situation in a position so that they can start ramping up again, what they keep finding is a promotion will come up, they won't go for it, and then they're dismissed. So all of these seem to be acting against women, particularly in tech organisations and industries, and we're seeing this dearth of balance then as a result. So to increase the number of women getting into the tech market, absolutely role models we do need. As I said, it's very hard to be what you can't see. And I think we're seeing industries really starting to take that on board in a number of different ways, both within the organisation, but also starting back in education. So we're seeing a lot of companies get involved in going back to oftentimes the schools that some of their people went to and talking to girls about careers in tech, talking about the opportunities that a career in tech can offer. There's a group of companies called Connecting Women in Technology. That is particularly their focus in terms of how do we actually get the next generation coming through wanting to have those kind of careers. So having those role models, and oftentimes it's having, female engineers and recent female graduates going in so that they can relate to different aspects of that opportunity and see, that could be me, I could do that, or that's something that really kind of interests me, and how do I go about doing it? So starting that early with role models, I think, is absolutely vital vitally important. And equally carrying that through into further education or higher education. We're seeing companies, for example, with the apprenticeship program, for the first time ever, really focusing in on, well, what number of female apprentices are we getting through and why? Changing their advertising to make sure that there are as many females on the ad as there are men, so that we're having that level of gender balance, that it's perfectly normal that we would expect to see that gender balance, to try and again get over the fact that oftentimes it's seen as a man's job or a woman's job, and that there isn't that crossover. So I think it's vitally important to have those role models, and really the difference that it makes. One of the companies that we work with has seen, I think this year alone, a 200% increase in the number of women coming through for recruitment, and an equal increase in the numbers of being successful into their apprenticeship program. So we're starting to see that happening, and we need to keep it up. Here in IBEC, the type of work that we do around these kind of policies for looking at gender balance, if you like, looks at all aspects. So starting with the education system, all the way through to childcare, all the way through to the organisations themselves. So we would work on two different levels. So first of all, we would work with our member organisations. So looking at things like policies and practices within those organisations, their strategies around diversity and inclusion, kind of where are the obstacles to progression within the organisation, and looking literally back to basics. So starting with the recruitment policies, starting with the job ads and the job descriptions. We know from research that if a female looks at a job description or a job advertisement and they don't have 100% of the criteria, they are unlikely to apply for that job. For males, if they have 60% of the criteria, they'll throw their hat into the ring. So we need to be really cognizant of that and be only putting into the job description, job criteria, what is essential. Also, we need to be really careful around the language that we use, because we find, again, the language, if it is very stereotypically male, so things like challenging, competitive, market leader, boasting elements, that can be very unfriendly language. Whereas if it's neutralised by gender, in the sense of having both stereotypically male and stereotypically female, such as collaborative, trust, etc., having that mix of language, then it's not a problem for anybody. Quite subtle details, but starting at that level of basics all the way through. Then equally looking at within the system itself. So we know that, for example, a huge contributor to the gender pay gap and to gender imbalance is occupational segregation. And occupational segregation is where you've got more men kind of clustered in certain industries and more women clustered in certain industries and in certain job types. And we know that dates back to our education curriculum at second level. So particularly in same-sex schools, where certain subjects aren't offered to girls or to boys' schools, very much on gendered lines, so things like home economics versus physics and mechanical drawing. And similarly in mixed sex schools, gendered curricula, where it kind of pits those subjects against each other, so you can't do both. So we know that we need to see reform at that level, so that it doesn't have a narrowing of career decisions at that level, so that we don't see it trickle through the whole way through, because that's what we're seeing at the moment. So we're doing, I suppose, a lot of lobbying work in that space as well. And then the other half of it, I suppose, is then we work very closely with government, and that would include being on the steering committee for the National Strategy for Women and Girls, feeding into kind of the different structures around that as to what needs to happen to ensure that we have gender balance and the fulfilment, I suppose, of equal opportunities at all levels of organisations and society for women and girls. We're also involved with the 30% Club, who are interested in targets around the women in senior roles and on boards, and we would be involved with Better Balance for Better Business, another government initiative to look at that level of balance around our boardroom tables for men and women. So there'd be a huge amount of different types of policy initiatives at different levels, but probably across the board. We would bring out different white papers as well around how we can tackle female labour market participation, because it is something that we really do need to tackle, and more so now as that this war for talent continues to be an issue. And things like, for example, the cost of childcare is a major factor in this. If it comes down to a childcare cost, oftentimes it means one of the parents has to come out of the workplace for a period of time, or to reduce their hours for a period of time, and more often than not we're seeing that being the mother rather than anybody else. So this is something that we have to address if we're serious about gender balance in our organisations and in our society. The gender pay gap and this whole area of female staff kind of trying to do things to get the parity in place. I suppose I should probably step back a step in the sense that there's a huge amount of confusion around the gender pay gap and what it is and what it isn't, I suppose, because a lot of commentators at the moment have been using equal pay and the gender pay gap interchangeably, and the two terms are entirely different. So what the gender pay gap is measuring is the average hourly rate of pay of all the men and all the women in your organisation, from the receptionist to the CEO. So what it actually is measuring is not a pay gap per se, as so much as a representation gap. So if you have a greater number of men in senior positions or higher paid positions in your organisation and a greater number of women in lower paid positions in your organisation, you will have a larger gender pay gap. In terms of what we need to do to address that, I think it's not just down to the women at all, because it really is a structural piece. And I suppose IBEC have called very much for a whole of society approach to it. We think gender pay gap reporting is going to be really, really helpful in this matter, because it will bring a level of attention to a discussion that we've been having. And we've seen a lot of progress over the years, but we've sort of stalled in our momentum, and this will be another opportunity to push forward, because the kind of things that we need to look at are some of the things actually that we've talked about. So things like the cost of childcare, occupational segregation, and the type of subjects that we offer in our schools, because all of those are contributing to where we find men and women within our organisations. If we were to find that the gender pay gap is quite high, where oftentimes we see women of childbearing years or around that kind of time, and we need to look in the organisation and say, okay, how are we on family friendly? How are we on flexible working? Do we make assumptions about women with children that we don't make about them before they had children, in terms of commitment and so on? Because all of the stereotypes and biases that we have out there all feed into this whole area. So once we've looked at that, we also need to look, though, is it the cost of childcare that's prohibiting people coming back in a way that they're actually able to engage with their career again? And so it really is going to require a whole of society approach, but across government levels, across organisational levels, and from an individual perspective, I suppose being open to change in those areas, and working around how we do things. So some of it is about how we engage with the system, and that's not a fix the women in any sense of the word, but in terms of, we know, for example, the idea of going for a job if we don't have all of the criteria is something that women struggle with. So knowing that, maybe taking the risk and actually going for it anyway. Or if somebody is within the organisation reaching in and saying, why haven't you put your CV in, actually taking the risk and going for it, because the chances are it's not going to do you any harm, and actually you could be the perfect person that they're looking for. So we need to do a number of things across a number of different layers to really see a difference in gender pay gap.